Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is David Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine, and I am joined today by the great Astra Taylor. She is one of the co-founders of the Debt Collective. She is also a documentary filmmaker and writer. She is the author of books like Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. She is co-author of the upcoming book, Solidarity, The Past, Present, and Future of a World-Changing Idea, co-authored with Leah Hunt Hendricks. And she's also the author of the new book that we are here to talk to her about today, based on her CBC Massey Lectures. It is called The Age of Insecurity, Coming Together as Things Fall Apart, which Rebecca Solnit calls a stunning work of social theory. Astra Taylor, thank you for joining us at Current Affairs.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Well, so your lectures are oriented around this dichotomy between security and insecurity. And we'll talk about insecurity, but the word security kind of fascinates me because it's so often associated with the political right. You think security, you think security systems, you think national security. The people who are most obsessed with security seem to be, well, you know, those who are fearful and paranoid. But you articulate a concept of security that you think the left ought to embrace. So tell us a bit more about what you think security ought to mean when we hear that word.
In general, I'm for struggling over words. I think we need to struggle over words. And you see this in a lot of my books. So my work on democracy, I made a film called What is Democracy? And then wrote a companion book, Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. You know, democracy is a tainted word, right? And I went into that project thinking, maybe we need to throw out this word democracy. I know you and I both like the word socialism. How many times have you heard somebody say, we need a new word? It's like, no, we have a word. What we need to do is struggle over it and imbue it with meaning, struggle to realize it. Certainly this forthcoming book on solidarity is less a reclaiming of the word, but more about let's think it through. Now, security is perhaps the most kind of queasy of these terms. And, you know, I came of age under the war on terror. And I think that was partly what gave me a deep ambivalence towards democracy, because that was the period of democracy promotion where the United States under George W. Bush was bringing democracy through force to the Middle East. But there was big talk of security, as you just pointed out, right? I really do associate it with homeland security, national security. We're hearing a lot today, right, about the Israeli security state as it wages war on the civilians of Gaza. So why talk about this? And I think that's because there are other meanings to the term, and they are actually essential to the left, and we can't just see them to the right. We want to be secure. We want to know that we're going to be safe. We want to know that we're going to be fed. We want to know that we're going to be housed. We want to know that we won't be destitute in old age. There's nothing wrong with that. Why should we let the right have that concept and that emotional terrain? Because it's powerful emotional terrain. And that's what I try to show. The desire for security, feelings of insecurity are potent political forces. And the right is tapping into that each day, every day, saying, hey, you're afraid, be more afraid. Let us protect you with borders, with police, with the military, you know, with market mechanisms that will actually make you feel worse, with authoritarian political figures, right, who are going to be misdirecting your anxieties and your vulnerabilities. So, you know, I think, you know, there's a word here. Let's think about it. Let's reconceptualize it. And, you know, security actually can be a beautiful thing. So the last I'll say here is that I love etymology. It's a recurring theme also of a lot of my writing. When you go back to the Latin root of the word security, the word care is in there. Cura is at the heart. And that's the key, right? That the security we need is the security of caring for each other, of building bonds of solidarity, of recognizing our shared vulnerability, our shared insecurities, and finding a kind of collaborative, cooperative, sustainable form of security that is in direct opposition to this defensive, individualistic, toxic form of security.
Yeah, so they say, well, we'll hole you up in your castle, stockpile as many weapons as you need to feel safe and comfortable, and finally you will achieve this state of security. But you never will that way. And that's one of the points that you make too, is that this is kind of an illusion. And you cite this wonderful, I haven't read the Kafka story about the mole building his hole and, trying to block off every little passageway to finally feel secure. But then, there keeps being this little noise, and you can never achieve that perfect sense of calm and safety that you aspire to through these defensive means. But I think that story is a wonderful, wonderful analogy for the way that some of us try to seek security in the contemporary United States and in Canada too.
The Burrow is what it's called. It's a short Kafka story called The Burrow. And, I had long wanted to write about Kafka and sort of had this research brief that was growing and growing. I actually was like, maybe I could put him in the Solidarity book because, Kafka is, of course, a brilliant artist, but he was known in his actual life more as an industrial reformer, and he worked at the state agency, an early example of the nascent welfare state where he was in charge of workers' compensation insurance, which was a new development. And he spent so much energy trying to protect workers from all of the hazards of the job. And, one of the many people redefining risk in that period and saying, it's not the worker's fault. Actually, there's the sort of systemic risks in the industrial workplace, and we have to address those instead of just blaming workers as individuals. But, he's also such a great character in that he's this kind of gentle artist type. He's a vegetarian defying his butcher father, which I really like about him too. But yeah, the story is quite a parable. And the story of this creature who seems like he's a mole building this burrow and constantly trying to shore up his security in these underground tunnels against some threat that you don't know if it's actually all in the mole's mind. And he's hoarding his possessions. He's sort of going around making sure that he has everything that he thinks he needs. It's this kind of self-destroying prophecy because he's not really living. He's just protecting himself. And so the point there too is not only that this individualistic burrow bunker mentality is doomed, but that there's we always need to question our fears. This is one of the complexities of insecurity that I try to talk about throughout the book is you might feel insecure, but our emotions can sometimes play tricks on us. And so we also need to interrogate that and ask, which of our insecurities, which of our fears are sort of valid, which are being sort of played upon or exaggerated. And yes, we have to talk about emotions. I think that's really important, but we also need to be, critical of them too, because we can deceive ourselves.
I didn't realize until reading your book that Kafka has a body of work that most people don't read, which is collected in a book called Franz Kafka, The Office Writings, from his time working in the Workmen's Accident Insurance Institute, which includes such lost classics as the one you quote for, which is measures for preventing accidents from wood planing machines, and other similar accident prevention reports and things on risk. I don't know if it's a riveting volume, but I'm totally fascinated by it now.
I mean, he wrote huge amounts on this stuff at his job. And we all know that, there's this vague idea that Kafka had this job, he hated it, he wanted to write. But Kafka understood his job was really important. And in that one you just cited, the accidents on wood planing machines, he invented a new type of saw to protect people's fingers from lacerations. And he saved lives in his work. And so I just think that makes him, all the more interesting. I'm drawn, of course, to figures who kind of wear different hats, have different, kind of weird trajectories. And yeah, he was certainly committed to that work. And, fundamentally, the question of, he's raising questions about insurance and risk that I think where I go at the end of the book to say, okay, insecurity is not just a personal phenomenon, it's the political one. So we need, structural ways of attending to these problems. And Kafka kind of points the way, because ultimately what he argued was, hey, instead of dealing with workers' comp after the fact, like, how about if we just make things safer to begin with? Like, instead of paying a worker because he's lost his hand, let's just make it so he doesn't lose his hand. Yeah. It's a good principle,
You say that you're drawn to people who wear different hats. I'm reminded that the New Yorker recently covered your book, and the opening sentence is, Astra Taylor has a resume that defies the notion of resume building, and then goes on to list the many eclectic things that you have done in your life.
Yeah, that was good. I was like, that's fair.
Yeah. Especially when you see them listed like cruising around in a Volvo with Cornell West. So, but to go back to what you were saying about the kind of fears that so many of us have and how some of them are manufactured. There's a kind of news story that recurs in the United States that's so tragic, that happens over and over, which is every year there are dozen or so gun owners who accidentally mistake a member of their family for an intruder, and they shoot them, and often they die. And you think this is to me, it's the most horrible possible thing that could happen, because it's entirely your fault. So you have to live for the rest of your life knowing that but these are people who thought they were protecting their family. They thought they were, making themselves more secure. They thought they were dealing with threats and eliminating all of the terrible things in the world. And in the end, they ended up destroying, that very security that they sought. And it seems to me like that kind of stuff. I mean, that is the most extreme sort of horrible example, but it seems like there are so many ways in which in our quest to eliminate danger, right? Post 9/11, obviously the United States foreign policy response ended up making the threat of terrorism worse. There are so many ways in which that pursuit of security, which we understand why people want to feel, ends up, ruining the very thing that we're trying to get. You're listening to the Current Affairs podcast from Current Affairs magazine in New Orleans, Louisiana. Current Affairs is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we depend entirely on reader subscriptions and donations. You'll notice we have no ads, no mattresses, no recruiters, no sports betting. If you can help us in our mission to build independent progressive media, please visit currentaffairs.org/donate to make a donation, or currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Now, back to the program.
Yes, and I think that happens in very dramatic ways. So, I mentioned briefly the war on terror and why that's a formative example for me, and why growing up in the shadow of the war on terror reminded me we always have to ask security of what, for whom, at what cost, right? And the point about gun violence is exactly right. I mean, there's just overwhelming evidence that it doesn't make people safer in the sense that they think it's going to make them safer, but rather, there can be tragedies like you just laid out. Or, if you are a woman or a child, there's just a bigger risk that you're going to be killed by domestic violence using that gun. So there's a paradox there, that the things that we pursue, or the things that we think will bring us security, undermine it. But I think it just happens in a much more banal way. I think, and this is why in the book I talk about the manufacture of insecurity, the way that insecurity is actually a really essential motor for capitalism. What that does is it causes us to be on this constant treadmill pursuing, security through various means. So we are told the way to find security in old age is by investing in the stock market, which of course is always a volatile prospect. But the chances are, even if you screen your investments, you're invested in toxic shit that's bad for workers, bad for the environment, ultimately bad for you. You're told to pursue higher education. Well, as I know all too well as an organizer with the debt collective, that buries working class people in unpayable debts that ultimately undermine their security. You're told to buy a house. Well, and if you manage to hold on to it, you're helping to raise housing values and push out your neighbors and, ultimately create a kind of instability in your community. That's capitalism, which is why I think we need to be committed to the socialist project of saying, no, let's provide security as a matter of right, meaning real secure security that can help people not just survive, but live thriving lives. To break out of that security paradox.
You say the powerful have never wanted the masses to be secure. Do you explain why that is? And, from examples like the church telling you that you constantly need to be in, fear for your soul, need to worry about going to hell, to bosses who want you to feel like your job is always on the line, that if you step out of line, your entire livelihood could be taken away from you. And there was all this panic during the pandemic and afterwards that, workers were becoming too secure. They were too confident in themselves, and things needed to be reversed. They needed to have that, you quote Barbara Ehrenreich, the fear of falling. And all of us have that terrible fear that even if we're doing okay right now, it could all go away in a moment. So it's not even just about, you need to make sure people have a decent paycheck and decent healthcare, because if they're constantly haunted by that fear that in a moment it could all disappear, then they're going to constantly feel a sense of, crippling insecurity.
Yeah, no, I mean, 100%. And there's just a lot of socioeconomic, research that says that when people anticipate threats, so it's, insecurity is always forward looking. It's not about absolute deprivation, but about expectation. So if you're like, I'm okay now, but I feel that things are going to get worse, there's evidence that people kind of close ranks. They're more susceptible to authoritarian politics. They're just more guarded. They're more inclined to think, hey, that burrow is looking pretty good right now. There's no way I would have written this book without Barbara Ehrenreich's Fear of Falling, which is one of those books I pored over in my early 20s and was like, oh, what an amazing book of cultural analysis. It's really entertaining. And it's, I think the subtitle is something like The Psychic Life of the Middle Class or something, but it's essentially a portrait of the professional middle class and the sense, that our society is structured so they can't rest, right? They don't have enough wealth to pass on to their kids in the sense, hey, here's your fortune, you'll never have to work again. And, our society is very volatile. Like, as I mentioned, the stock market can crash. You can have a medical emergency and see your family's savings be decimated. You can be laid off and when your job is outsourced. So people do, even people who are doing okay are not wrong to feel insecure under the economic status quo. But you laid it out really well. Basically, security is a threat to the powerful because it makes us need them less. And I really do think the debate around the COVID income assistance programs is the most telling. We saw a radical expansion of the social safety net in the US and Canada and abroad, caused child poverty to plummet. Low-wage workers were finally able to say, hey, okay, maybe I won't rush into the next horrible, abusive job. Maybe I'll wait a week or two and try to negotiate, earn an extra 50 cents, $1, $2, $3. That would be amazing. And that was a threat to the people who run our economy and are in charge of monetary policy. And, they often use euphemisms about the fact we need to, bring down prices, including the price of labor, and restore balance to the economy. But, as I show in the book, Janet Yellen, who is now the Treasury Secretary appointed by Joe Biden, wrote a memo in the 90s where she waxed poetic about how useful job insecurity is to bosses. She said, I'm essentially quoting, but she said, insecurity makes workers more desirous of pleasing their employers, less likely to shirk on the job, right? Less likely to quit. And that was echoed by Alan Greenspan and others, and Alan Greenspan made the point that, it's worker insecurity isn't enough. It actually has to keep ratcheting up to keep having its effect. And we live now, in the shadow of that ratcheting. So absolutely, security is a threat to the status quo. And that's part of why I think the left should reclaim it. Why are we leaving that on the table? Yeah. Right? The security we're fighting for should be the security that is a threat to the boss.
Yeah. Just a side note, everyone should read every book Barbara Ehrenreich ever wrote, because after her death, I went to write a review of her books, and I was just struck by even the minor books that people haven't read or heard of. They're always fascinating and profound.
I agree. And she also, had a PhD in biology. She wrote about everything from, joy to midwifery to
death and death. Collective. Yeah.
Huge icon.
So I didn't even realize until I read your book, it kind of helped me understand something, which is that there's all these people, Joe Biden is running for re-election, and there's all these news stories about how even though the Biden economy is doing really well, voters don't appreciate it, right? That, incomes are going up, unemployment's down, GDP's doing fine, and yet, there's a great sense of dissatisfaction with Joe Biden and the Biden economy. Why is this? Why could this be? And your book, I think, helps give us a framework that can help us kind of understand some of this, which is, well, hang on a minute. As we say, it doesn't really mean much what you have if you are constantly terrified of losing it. And if we think that the pandemic was this terrible shock that, oh my God, the whole world can change overnight. Our circumstances can change overnight. If we see the looming climate disasters in front of us, if we see the threat of escalating global warfare, no wonder people don't feel great. It's forward looking and not just present looking.
Yeah, I've also been, those articles stress me out, right? Because people writing them and the people making policy, the people in the Biden administration need to get it. They're not factoring in, by just looking at sort of macroeconomic trends, like
right.
Overall job growth, overall GDP, they're not breaking it down and looking at how intense inequality still is. And there's still this attitude too of like, it's not quite let them eat cake, but it's like, we give them some crumbs and they're not, thrilled about it. But I think the forward-looking part is really important. And so I begin the book with a kind of rumination on how, we need to think about inequality, the gulf between the have and the have-nots for sure, which has been a major frame through which progressives on the left have been thinking about the crisis of democracy and the problems with our economy. But insecurity is important because unlike inequality, which just gives a kind of portrait of this snapshot in time, like, oh, the rich are this rich and the poor are this poor. Insecurity has that affective dimension, the emotional dimension, and again, that forward-looking dimension. So it's not just about deprivation, it's about expectation. And as you laid out, people are totally right to be worried right now. They know those gains can slip away. They know that the rent is too damn high and the landlord is going to raise it because that's what they do and nobody's stopping them. They know that the price of groceries are higher than they've been. And they have a sense like, well, they could probably go up again. It's just a losing strategy to try to argue with people in this kind of robotic, rational way and say, well, look at the macroeconomic data. Things are not as bad as you're thinking. When the right, again, is talking to people's emotions and saying, hey, you've got fears? Well, at least we'll acknowledge them. We won't give you a solution. We'll tell you to hate the even more vulnerable. But at least we are acknowledging your anxiety. So, this discussion just causes me more anxiety because we have to live in the world these idiot Democrats are creating by denying, by denying the obvious. Like this shouldn't be that hard to get,
Yeah. It got me thinking that the distribution of wealth, the distribution of security matters just as much as the distribution of actual wealth, what you have to be afraid of. And if the right comes along and tells you, look, there are all these terrible things to be afraid of, but we are going to make you safe. And I feel like this is something that Biden doesn't understand is you've got to make people feel safe. I certainly feel when I have had very little money and I have had a windfall of some money, just a little bit of money in order to, there's something in my bank account. Well, that's great. But I know that in this economy, I look at it and I go, well, it's just a matter of time before something comes along that takes all the money, right? I don't feel like that is my money. I feel like that is I feel like I'm waiting for the next surprise bill. I mean, in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I got a surprise medical bill from a year ago. I didn't think they were going to charge me. They charged me. And so sure enough, huge part of my banking just gone because you can't feel secure with anything that you have.
And we need to decouple security from wealth because that's what capitalism tells us. It's like, okay, well, we're going to erode the welfare state. We're going to take away your job security, but take away your pension. So that leaves one avenue and one avenue alone, which is, to put that money in that bank account, fill the burrow up with gold. And, and you shouldn't have to be rich to be secure. And actually, there are lots of ways to provide security for people who lack funds. I mean, we don't want to import everything about Cuba, but they have healthcare and people are poor. They have health security. I think has to be at the core of our project too. It's like we want people to feel safer because they are safer because their basic needs are met.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are all sorts of ways in which, I mean, you talk about how, look, some insecurities are because we are human beings and we are all going to die someday and we can't eliminate our mortality. So you can't eliminate fear and anxiety. There are existential insecurities, as you call them, but there are also all these manufactured insecurities, these things that make us anxious and afraid that we don't need. Coming back to it, in your book, you cite the example of your sister worked at a coffee shop and just was casually having a conversation with a customer. It's caught on video. The boss calls and says, don't talk to the customers because everything is a panopticon.
Yeah. I mean, it's happening everywhere is a panopticon, every workplace. I mean, workers are monitored through various apps and services in countless domains, blue collar and white collar. So radiologists at the hospital are tracked, obviously UPS and FedEx drivers, Amazon workers. But even at this bohemian cafe, I mean, full of kind of shabby antiques, it was actually the place was just littered with security cameras. And, again, what does security mean? Security of what, for whom, at what cost? This was not about protecting the workers from external threats. This was about, protecting the boss's bottom line by making the workers feel that they were perpetually at risk of losing their jobs, even when they were doing something like just showing a little extra kindness to a regular, which you think would be good for business. And so something people have been accustomed to basically being treated like shit. Yeah. And, that's again why I think that the idea of security is something we need to reclaim, because it's like, no, it should be harder to fire you. It should be harder to evict you. Mm-hmm. It should be a whole lot harder to profit from people's poverty, from people's pain, from people's unexpected, medical emergencies. And that's something that, shouldn't be that radical. I am trying to ride in the frame. I mean, I spend a lot of my time organizing with the debt collective, which means I'm organizing with debtors who have negative net wealth by definition. But I think, middle-class people have a lot to gain from a system that provides more material security as a matter of right. And, I think given some of the psychological pathologies we're seeing among the billionaire class, that they'd be better off too if we expropriated their wealth and forced them to be more normal.
Yeah. We should consider those things insecurity cameras, because they are there to generate insecurity on behalf of the people being watched.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there's the word securitization, right?
Oh, yes, you mentioned that.
Right. Securitization means, bundling up debts, using them as sort of securities in the kind of Wall Street financial sense. And a friend said, oh, we should talk about insecuritization, right? Which is also a process. And it is dependent on, as you just pointed out, insecurity cameras, work policies that are, create job insecurity and the like. And that's really what I want to do is with this book is demystify the insecurity that's around us and say, yeah, a lot of this is imposed. It's unnecessary. It has, really grotesque goals, because it's there to enrich the already powerful, and let's denaturalize it.
I mentioned that you distinguish between the manufactured insecurities and the existential insecurities, because one could hear what we've been saying and think, aha, well, the goal then is to achieve security, to get through, to blast through the propagandistic false notions of security and achieve real, meaningful security and end the insecurity. This is not quite how you put it, because you, interestingly, say we have to embrace the fact that we are inherently insecure beings. So perhaps you could comment on the insecurity that you feel we are always stuck with and have to reconcile ourselves to, versus the kind that we can mitigate or eliminate.
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't need security if we weren't insecure. We wouldn't need social systems that provide care if we weren't beings in need of care. So in the book, I distinguish between what I call existential insecurity, which you've already mentioned, which is, the human condition. It's the kind of insecurity that all kinds of philosophers, have talked about, the fact that we're going to die, that we're fragile. It's a kind of insecurity that feminists and disability activists have talked about, the fact that we all need care throughout our lives. None of us are, autonomous agents. There is no such thing as the self-made individual. And that existential insecurity, I think, is difficult. And we have a range of reactions to it. I think some people really flee from that. They don't want to admit their vulnerabilities, and they're encouraged to deny them. But fundamentally, I think an acknowledgement of our insecurities is key to devising the more collaborative, communal, sustainable, democratic forms of security I think we should be aiming for, right? Because I want to see social security based on the recognition that we're interdependent, that accidents happen, that we aren't in total control, that we age, we get sick, shit happens. So let's figure out ways to deal with it together. So yeah, I contrast existential insecurity with what I call manufactured insecurity. And I'm also trying to provide just, a slightly different lens on capitalism. We understand capitalism as a system in which capital accumulates and wealth and power accumulate. Capital is a relentless force, and that's certainly the case. But I think, insecurity is actually a core product of capitalism as well, because you don't have a proletariat. You don't have a people who have nothing to sell but their labor, unless they are insecure, unless they're severed from other forms of subsistence, other forms of livelihood. We see that when we look back on the enclosure movement and the transition from feudalism to capitalism, that people had to be severed from land and livelihood to be turned into the working class as we now know it. And so insecurity is not just an unfortunate byproduct of our economic system, but actually I think a really core attribute of it.
Right.
And that manufactured insecurity, I think can be mitigated, and that we should do that. Then maybe, in our socialist paradise of material security, we could actually really have a bunch of philosophical discussions about what it means to be existentially insecure.
Yeah. You've mentioned that on the production side, workers are made to feel insecure, but you also point out that another form of manufactured insecurity is on the consumption side. You say that satisfied customers are not profitable. No advertising department ever tells us we're okay. So we are constantly, in addition to the risk of being fired, also being bombarded with messages constantly that say that we need to buy more to be happy, obviously.
Yeah. It's almost such a banal point that I feel like we don't talk about it enough. But
yeah, no, I agree.
I kind of rail against advertising in everything I've written. I mean, going back to the People's Platform, which is about the political economy of the internet, like so many pathologies of social media are driven by the fact that the people funding them are advertisers and marketing departments, and that we've given away our whole communications apparatus to the field of advertising, which by definition is an industry aimed at misinformation, right? You don't go like, oh, truth, I think I'll watch an ad. So no wonder there's all this bullshit being promulgated in those spaces. And so trillions of dollars, like huge amounts of money are spent on advertising because it works. It does keep the treadmill of consumption going. Most of it does assault our self-esteem and has, I think, really pernicious consequences. And I think it's just a huge waste of money, a huge waste of human creativity, and that money could be better spent. And so, I will continue to rail against it like an angry teenager till the end of time. But I think it's one of the sort of prime examples. And, people might not really want to face it, but, we're subjected to it all the time. And it certainly has emotional and social consequences. And so I think it is important to denaturalize advertising too. This is not something that I think this is a huge industry based on manufacturing insecurity. It's not good for us. It's not good for the planet.
Yeah, it's weird. I feel like the left, kind of in the 90s, there were a lot of critiques of advertising, no logo and stuff. And then I feel like we left kind of moved away from this and towards, kind of understandably talking about workers, talking about how things are produced. But it's still the case that, it is designed to make every advertisement assumes you can be made to feel like you need to alter what you already have, that you would be better off if you handed your money over to someone else.
I think the left has gotten better, right, to go beyond kind of consumerist politics alone, and which kind of became almost aesthetics and not politics, but there's still something there. And advertising could be subjected to strong regulations from the state. We could also undermine the obsolescence that those sort of planned obsolescence advertising encourages by saying, no, everyone has the right to repair things. Things have to be made to last with good union jobs. So, we've maybe overcorrected, I think, from the days of my teenagehood.
I think there's fairly strong empirical evidence that it's connected to the rise in teen suicides. It's not just economic.
Oh no, absolutely. I think it's really, it's doing a number on younger folks without a doubt. And I think has certainly reached crisis levels.
So, one of the things we do on the left, and that you do so well in this book and in your other work, is to say things don't have to be this way. Things can be different than they are. These are not natural features. They're not immutable. They're not handed down to us from above. That we can achieve a world of real and meaningful security, other than the existential insecurities that we may never get rid of. And you've done that so well over the past decade with debt, right? With changing, really succeeding, actually. You and the Debt Collective and the other activists coming out of Occupy kind of succeeded in changing the discourse around debt, making people feel as if debt, which was, as David Craven pointed out, there's this kind of sense of it as this natural moral obligation that you couldn't get rid of. And they're thinking, no, we are the ones who decide whether we think the quote, your debts must be paid is a natural feature of the world. So, I mean, that's kind of an example of how, I do think people's thinking can change and the policies can change accordingly.
I mean, people's thinking does change. I mean, people's thinking has changed over the course of my lifetime. I mean, if you read any history, you're like, wow, they really thought differently than we do today. The world is changeable. And, I think you're right, though, that this is a prime, every single thing I've ever written, all the people I admire, right? It's just like, hey, folks, we could reorganize society. We can do this better, a little kinder, a little gentler, a little more sustainably. And I think the Debt Collective is a great example because we're a really small group that we were not veteran organizers. None of us had very much experience at all, if any. We were artists. I was making films about philosophy. And what we did have, though, was a commitment to closing the gap between what we were doing and our values. We had a kind of playful spirit too of like, well, let's just try this. Let's try this crazy idea of organizing the world's first debt strike and to see if it works, to see if we can get any traction. So for me, I just think like what we need is more. We need more organizing, more people stepping up to try to change things. Books are great. I think books and magazines and podcasts are part of the process of changing the narrative and getting people to think differently. But ultimately, this is a power struggle, and we need people to organize and be as rigorous and ruthless as the right-wing opposition, which is a tall fucking order at this moment. So, we've got to all step up to the plate.
Yeah, I like your work, so I don't want this to sound... I was surprised by how much this book made me think, right? I just went in thinking, because we talk about security, insecurity all the time. But, food insecurity, housing insecurity, yeah. But you say, okay, but let's think about what this actually means. And it did, in fact, as I mentioned, it got me thinking. And so that's I think Rebecca Solnit is right in her high praise for this book on the cover. And I think people should pick it up. And I didn't get a chance to ask you about the Roman goddess Cura you begin the book with. But what I will tell our listeners is that if they pick up the book and they read the book, or they listen to your lectures, which have just been posted online, the CBC Massey Lectures, then they can meet the goddess Cura. We'll leave that to tantalize them. So the book is The Age of Insecurity, coming together as things fall apart. The CBC Massey Lectures by Astra Taylor. Astra Taylor, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you so much. It was a big honor.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.